Thank you, Lisa, for that wonderful introduction. Firstly, I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I also want to thank Lisa and Vada for this really amazing opportunity and privilege of being able to share my views and knowledge today. You can hear I'm a tiny bit nervous, but what I can see out there is a sea of really warm and welcoming women. So I'm really looking forward to having, and I can see there's a few men in the audience, so welcome. So Lisa's actually asked me, she's given me a rather large task, I thought I'd like, and I've been pondering on this for a while, and as Lisa alluded to, I've actually technically retired, so I'm not necessarily immersing myself in academic work or literature, but nonetheless I'm still active. But yeah, retirement for a woman in the latter stages of her life is interesting. Anyway, can't believe I said those words, but nonetheless I did. Anyway, for this presentation, I will be briefly discussing my involvement in the women's movement and how radical feminism played a critical role in helping me make sense of women's oppression, knowledge to better understand the experience of women using drugs and alcohol, and the development of practices to address the discriminatory and oppressive social reality of their lives. Secondly, I just want to briefly talk about my PhD and feminist discussions which challenge the portrayal of women as passive victims in their patterns of behaviour. My study also reveals the impact of drug and alcohol on women's criminal offending, so I thought it might be useful to touch on that. Thirdly, I'd like to address the personal challenges of working as a feminist against the resistances of male power and privileges. Kerri will follow up. Kerri and I have had a long working relationship today, not today, but for many, many years. So it's wonderful to be able to have this opportunity to work with her. So we've tried to coordinate our conversations with you today. So Kerri will discuss the history and ambitions of the Women's Alcohol and Drug Service. As Kerri will describe to you, it continues to be the only statewide drug and alcohol service providing clinical services and professional support in the care of pregnant women with complex substance use and alcohol dependence. And interestingly enough, I'll go off script here a bit, but it's actually remains the only funded drug and alcohol service, maternity service across all of Australia that's funded. Since 1987 it was funded. So that's just a bit of a story about women's experiences and support across the sector. It's a cautionary tale, I say. Because it's an audience of women, I'm assuming that we have all had some experience with the women's movement. So some of my narrative here will not be familiar to you. But all of that I speak to you today is really important to me. You should never go to the me. Anyway, since the 1970s, from my experience, there's been a worldwide movement to promote and protect the human rights and fundamental freedoms of women. Networks and coalitions of women have worked decades to ensure women enjoy cultural, economic, political and social development. But recent events globally will tell us that the women's rights remain a risk and there is still much more work to be done. There continue to be a number of complex, critical and stigmatised areas of women's health where barriers and service gaps affect women's capacity to access responsive and comprehensive care. This is particularly true for women impacted by drug and alcohol use who seek access to appropriate treatment, care, support and rehabilitation. We know that women impacted by drug and alcohol use, and particularly my experience of those who are pregnant, have complex needs, often shaped by experiences of childhood trauma, violence, sexual assault, neglect, poverty, homelessness, and poor mental health. It is my contention that these experiences and trauma are shaped by the discriminatory policies and practices across our service systems that are underpinned by established patriarchal ideas, structures and priorities, and widely accepted gender stereotypes where the male experience remains the norm. It's my contention, and research supports this, is that in the absences of a gender lens, the distinct needs of women and children are not integrated. In fact, they're overlooked and their voices rarely heard. This often translates to them being denied access to early, appropriate and safe treatment, care and support. So for me, how did I get to this position? I was a single mother at the age of 18, 19, and so tertiary education happened for me at the age of 25. And at that period of time, I fell willingly into the well of feminist theories as they helped me to better understand the sources of oppression, including my own. I was particularly drawn to radical feminism, and I proudly then and I proudly now call myself a radical feminist. And like other radical feminists influenced by the women's movement in the 1980s, I understood and still understand patriarchy to be the source of oppression for women. The fundamental theme of radical feminism is and was that women as the social group are oppressed by men, and that this oppression causes the suffering of women. In radical theorising, it was women's bodies, reproductive capacities and sexuality were considered. This is going back to the 60s and 70s, and it's still fundamentally true about radical theorising today, but are considered primary sites of male domination, limiting women's capacity to function as full human beings. Individual acts of male violence, it's argued, are intrinsic to this wider oppression and control of women by men. Every avenue of power, could be every hour, every avenue of power in society, according to radical feminists, is deeply rooted in history and social, cultural and economic structures, sustaining women's oppression and inequality. It is this body of research, this body of work that has enabled me to capture an understanding of how women's oppression was sustained and produced. It still remains quite pivotal to me 4 decades later. And I suppose it was the work of radical feminists in the 1980s also that drew attention to the ways in which women were victimised in the areas of sexual assault. I've got a little bug. In the area of sexual assault, sexual harassment and domestic violence. The work of radical feminists in the 1980s, 1990s, and still currently exposed the empirical work which helped to expose ways in which the nature and extent of women's oppression. And as I'll talk about a little bit later in criminology area, you'll notice that there's an absence in it was from the 1970s that, female criminologists actually brought attention to an understanding of women's criminal offending in relation to their drug and alcohol use. Prior to that period, there was very little empirical work or understanding of women's nature of drug and alcohol use in the criminological areas. Now, from the 1980s, greater academic attention was paid to class and race differences between men and women, and that we understand that there's no unitary explanation that can be generalised to account for all experiences. This was particularly important to understand for me and for the women I was working with, and it was really important, it has been all the way through my work, is that understanding that we as all women, we struggle, that while all women struggle similarly with, I'll say that again, but the notion that all women struggle similarly with the sexist and abusive practices of patriarchy really was debunked by research. And the feminist movement really also dismantled and challenged certain assumptions about gender relations, and also has helped to reveal the fragility of gender identities and the fluidity of gender categories. All of that body of work and theory is really particularly helpful for me, and it also helped to guide me. Educated as a social worker, I was also educated to the practices and theories of feminist social work practice. This theoretical work has assisted feminist organisations throughout the decades to develop non-discriminatory and non-oppressive practices in work with women and men. When I entered the drug and alcohol field, I had prior to that spent a great deal of time working in the women's health and also in the educational arena. I found that there was a great emphasis on medical knowledge, and while I consider and still consider this to be incredibly critical, it's also equally important as a feminist to draw on other bodies of knowledge that gives us ways to achieve equality, social justice and autonomy for women. Although I find in the drug and alcohol field that's not always, we're not open to some of those discussions. I hope this next bit is helpful, but it's important to know for me that the work of the feminist movement in the 60s and 70s and 80s and that which continues today is actually being built on centuries of women's movement actions. And so what I'm just going to talk about, for me as a social worker, me engaged in radical practice, these particular principles are pivotal principles in terms of guiding the development of myself and how I work with women and how I have worked in the development of services to support women. So the first principle for me that's been important to my work is consciousness raising. Oh, we're all familiar with this, but it does give women the opportunity to discuss their experiences from their own viewpoints. Importance of validating social context for women. Recognising again that gender is a critical experience in the lives of women and understanding always how the construction of gender constrains women. Always recognising that the personal is political, understanding that when we're working with women that their personal experiences are reflective of wider societal and cultural conditions. It's also reconstructing the nature of deviance. As a feminist, it's important to contest the patriarchal knowledge which defines women as mad, bad or deviant or otherwise pathologises and demonises women. And it's about understanding that women who are presenting to us present with us the issues that they present with us are probable manifestations and responses to abuse and oppressive social conditions. This is particularly relevant for women involved in the drug economy. Oops. Inclusivity, including the voices and experiences to give women their visibility and to stem the dominance of male ideas and knowledge. And the sixth point is challenging reductionist models which codifies and defines the behaviour of both men and women. I found working in the field of pregnancy and drug and alcohol, there's an enormous amount of judgment and discrimination of women who are pregnant from the point of view is that what defines a good mother. So there's enormous judgment, and that judgment reduces women to being invisible. We make them visible. And also the opportunity for collective change. I think these are principles that have guided me throughout. When in doubt about who I am and what I am and confronted with challenges over the last 4 decades, I've always gone back to, am I following these principles of actions? They've always been important to me, and I know they're important for other feminist organisations. In my experience in the AOD sector, there's a tendency to reduce and characterise women's experiences in the discourse of victimisation. Victim of oppression, victim of structural inequality, victim of violence, victim of pharmacology. Now, while all of this is really highly relevant to understanding, it's also equally important to consider their agency and their resistances. Relying solely on a women's victimisation disallows women's personal responsibility, autonomy and agency. And we also cannot ignore their resistances. Women are often navigating themselves in really hostile environments, and the decisions they make are maybe not decisions that I make or you make, but they're particularly important decisions that they make for their own survival. But also uncritically accepting women as victims. Female drug users also are potentially located as an homogenous group, and they're not. They have different experiences of social class, ethnicity, sexual preferences, their age, and by assuming they're an homogenous group, we really also leave them little space for their own personal agency. So I'm going to move on. I'm hoping this is all going well. I've only got 1 minute left. Have I really? I've got so much more to do. Oh no. All right. I'm going to have to move on. I've got 1 minute left, so okay. I'm not going to be able to get a chance to talk about my thesis. I want to talk about the growing body of feminist research raising caution around the victimology thesis. It's criminological theories on women's offendings that have been helpful to me in challenging the portrayal of women as passive victims in the patterns of their behaviour, and it's been argued that there, is an overlap between women's experiences of victimisation and criminal offending. So there's a couple of, I won't talk about them, but there's some very great women in Australia, Ma and Denton, who have done some incredible studies in the criminological areas that actually contest the idea and argue that a lot of the work that we do can be very patronising and of women. We often in a lot of what we do is even in feminist arguments that we can either see women as needing an excuse. Not women don't always need an excuse. That's actually that tone in a feminist accounts of women needing excuses and judgment takes a form that's really quite a fairly reductionist way due to their status of women. I was going to talk about my thesis. I'll just very quickly. My thesis is about women who kill non-family, so women who kill strangers, friends and acquaintances. Why this work was actually important to me was that while I was managing the Women's Alcohol Drug Service, I was also undertaking this PhD for a 10-year period. It was quite brutal exercise, but what it did for me was it exposed it's difficult for feminists to actually acknowledge the culpability of women, But my research revealed a group of women who killed violently, with or without provocation. And in analysing the data, there are unexpected findings. If those are familiar with homicide research, that primarily homicides are committed in the context of unplanned events, but in my data, there were two major patterns, but the more of the homicides were done in a planned way. So these were unexpected findings. But importantly, women had histories of drug and alcohol use, and these were features of most of the murders. So while I'm not going to get it all done in a minute, so this is tricky, isn't it? Anyway, I recommend that you have a read. It's actually online. So, but I think what my results do is that it actually advises us that we need to frame the way that we understand women as having a sense of agency, but also we may be uncomfortable with the things that women actually do. Like I was very uncomfortable with the way that women were working. I was also very uncomfortable in my PhD about how drugs and alcohol were used, not only because of their experiences as a victim of life, they're also the way that drugs and alcohol were used to reduce the resistances of those who are going to be killed. So I think they're brutal, and I think what it does is opens a dialogue for us as feminists to ensure that we're researching the difficult things. But it's an invidious position to be in as a feminist to be characterising women as being violent, because it actually reduces our sense of our urgent need to support them as being victims of violence. But I think we need to challenge this. I've got to finish. All right. I just want to say that there's been many personal challenges for me working. One has to work against the resistances of male power and privileges. And I think it's important to say that the rise of right-wing conservative men's groups has had a pernicious impact on gender and feminist reform. I would just like to finish that also the struggles for me as a feminist leader is that I often also found my own voice and my contributions could be silenced and ignored. But what I did do throughout this period of time is that, and I've remained resilient, I've remained determined, and I remain brave. So that's what I was saying. Thank you.
Is there time for me, Lisa, or are we meant to move? Oh, yeah, okay. Thanks, everybody. And thanks, Theresa. I will click the clicker. So I will begin by acknowledging the lands where the Women's Hospital is based, the lands of the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present, to Aboriginal people in this audience today, and to the Aboriginal families that we work with at the Women's. And I want to acknowledge that we're meeting on stolen land, and this land always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'd also like to acknowledge lived experience and the valuable contribution and insights that those with lived experience provide to the sector and health service providers in general. And I want to acknowledge that I'm not speaking for all the women and patients or staff at the Women's Hospital. I'm speaking as a social worker who has worked at the Women's Alcohol and Drug Service for close to 14 years and in the addiction space for longer than this. I've worked with a lot of women and I've witnessed how policies, programs and service systems have not always met the needs of women who are affected by alcohol and drug issues. So I'm going to start with a video.
Women have learned the language of men, have lived in the house of men. You know how when you learn language, you learn French, you learn Spanish, it isn't your language until you dream in it. And the only way to dream in it is to speak it. And women speak men. But men don't speak women. They don't dream in it.
I think what Meryl's trying to say
Oh God, I love him.
It's a video about Meryl Streep, and Meryl Streep is talking about sexism and misogyny in the film industry. And she talks about how women speak the language of men, and we live in the houses of men, and we really understand and kind of work with this sort of concept of masculinity. It's ingrained in our thinking. It relates to the film industry, but it more broadly relates to other professional industries and the social and political sphere. And the speech is not so much about language in a literal sense. I think what she's trying to convey here is more about societal and cultural norms, and where white male masculinity has generally dominated historical and public discourse over the centuries. It's been embedded and ingrained into societal thinking. And it's not just individual men that sustain gender inequality. It's certainly not the many compassionate, insightful and highly intelligent men who I've worked with in the alcohol and drug and health sectors. It's a big and complicated problem, and men need to be involved in its resolution. And I thank those men who have arrived here today to support this. And whilst this speech is not necessarily about language, we also know that language and the capacity to communicate is extremely powerful. And language can reflect and reinforce our social norms. Language can be a powerful mechanism for change. Additionally, language can be highly manipulative and divisive. And I do believe that things are changing and enormous progress has been made, but in many aspects this change is incredibly slow. We can't miss Tony and our friend Trump here. And some of this slowness relates to the fact that we continue to have people, mostly men, in leadership positions who greatly influence decision-making and thinking about women and their bodies. And whilst I probably shouldn't be using these particular images in this presentation, it's slightly illegal, no image of any other public figure epitomised better both misogyny and sexism at its worst. These two men have publicly used language that is both degrading and dehumanising to men. Yet misogynist actions and words spoken by these men seem to be overlooked and forgiven by many, and it never ceases to amaze me that these public figures are still given a platform and a voice in modern society today. Now, I know that not all our political and policy leaders are anti-women or gender equality, but somehow the rules still seem to be different for men and women. Pay gaps still exist between men and women. The value of women in modern society is still considered yet less. And the fact that these men are able to get away with being publicly sexist and misogynist doesn't promote or foster public policy decisions that are in any way attuned to the specific needs of women or an array of other marginalised people or subgroups. And not to mention that I don't think a woman would get away with wearing a pillow on her ear, notwithstanding the fact that this is a serious and terrible incident. And I don't think a female Prime Minister could get away with walking around in a bikini or scant little suit and seek photo opportunity. Julia Gillard could barely get her hair cut without commentary about this. So broadly speaking, we know that the kind of public discourse and public dialogue that does nothing to address the very serious and significant issue of women being harmed by the men they know and care for. A huge percentage of women are not only subjected to violence perpetrated by partners on a regular basis, but 1 in 3 women are intentionally killed worldwide, are killed by an intimate partner. In Australia, the impact of intimate partner violence has a greater disease burden than alcohol and a much greater disease burden than illicit drug use. Yet drug use is stigmatised and those affected shamed, particularly if they are a woman and a parent, and especially so if they're pregnant. We know that women are impacted significantly by violence perpetrated by men, and whilst we've made some headway in this area, we are still a long way from resolving this very serious issue. And these statistics are from 2016. I doubt they're very different today. So on a more positive note, I'll talk briefly about the Women's Hospital. And I think it's an area where we have progressed, whilst there's still a long way to go. But I want to just provide a short tale about how a gender focus can improve outcomes, especially in health. The Women's Hospital was established in 1856 and at this time primarily cared for women who fell pregnant in the gold rush era, who were abandoned and left by their partners or husbands who went off to pursue gold. The hospital's establishment was led by a committee of women. The committee was led by Miss Frances Perry, who was then married to the Anglican Bishop of Melbourne. In recognising the needs of this particular group of women, the hospital was established with the support of 2 male doctors, Dr. Richard Tracy and Dr. John Maud. By the 1930s, the hospital was considered world-class in diagnosing and managing perinatal and post-abortion infections. However, research indicated at this time that 1 in 228 births resulted in the birthing person dying. Today, that would have meant 35 women would have died in childbirth at the Women's Hospital this year. Through research, education and the implementation of procedures that address the specific causes of women dying in childbirth, as well as the introduction of sulphur drugs, penicillin, the rate is now closer to 1 in 11,400 birthing people dying in Australia due to childbirth. Death during childbirth in the Western world is now a fairly rare occurrence. But what I'm trying to point out here is it took a very specific focus on women and their specific needs to improve outcomes in this very gendered area of perinatal and gynecological health. The Women's is now considered a leader in the provision of women's reproductive rights and is now one of the few health services in Victoria that provides late-term abortions for free. And most recently, the Women's has increased its capacity to support and provide care to women experiencing chronic pelvic pain. In saying all this, I can't neglect to mention that there are other not so great aspects of the Women's history, especially for Aboriginal families impacted by stolen generations, where the hospital played a significant role in the removal of children at this time. And I guess this is the time and how discourse, broad thinking impacts and influences how people respond in health services. The hospital has made major efforts to make up for past actions to improve the birthing experience for Aboriginal patients. And over the years I've worked at the Women's, I've certainly seen a considerable improvement and greater sense of safety for Aboriginal women and families who attend for care and birth at the hospital. But we still have a long way to go in this area also. So There is a recognition at the Women's Hospital that the needs of women are unique and that individual health outcomes are impacted by gender. The Women's, of course, also recognises there are other unique personal attributes that also affect health outcomes and access to health care. These are confounded when we consider the role of intersectionality and how overlapping forms of discrimination and marginalisation can lead to healthcare systems that are often unable to respond effectively to the needs of unique individuals. Many of these patients fall through the gaps. The Women's Alcohol and Drug Service, from its inception, remains a fairly unique service, and it was probably likely to have been a fairly controversial introduction to the hospital in 1985 when it was first established. It's the only state-funded program of its kind. And the service works with some of the most marginalised women who attend the Women's Hospital for care. The women often face not only drug and alcohol issues, but mental health issues, complex psychosocial issues that include interpersonal violence, homelessness, food insecurity. These women often have histories of trauma and grief and loss related to the loss of a loved one or the loss of their children through the child protection system. These women often face considerable stigma and shame due to their circumstances, and they have few options when it comes to accessing specific women's AOD support. So I'm going to finish here with this question. What would AOD service systems look like if men spoke women and lived in the houses of women, which is what Meryl Streep was saying in the video that I couldn't get to play? Would we have female-only detox facilities? Because it strikes me as quite odd that we don't, when we know that so many women experience violence perpetrated by men. But we don't have options for this. Will pregnant women be able to access the medically supervised injecting room? Controversial politically, but it is a gateway into healthcare and a gateway into getting support and safe injecting equipment, even if you're pregnant. Would we have long-term family support options for parents who have alcohol and drug issues that are caring for their children? Currently, we don't really have this intensive sort of program that would help support parents to care for their children, keep children in families, and work with them for longer. What support exists for parents who lose custody of their children due to alcohol and drug use? Would we have services that manage the experience of grief and loss and work with families to address this and support them to have a relationship with their children or regain custody? Would we have services that work with dads who have AOD and family violence issues in the antenatal and postnatal phase? It's such a crucial time for women and infants. And such major change could occur at this time if we educate dads about the impact of violence on their babies and their children. So I am going to finish there and leave you with some of those questions. What else would exist if we lived in a world where we think women? Thank you.